So we mentioned in class today that we looked at the feedback from our start, stop, continue, and one of the items for sure came through loud and clear is more review videos. So we were sort of under the impression they weren't being used that much, but happy to hear that they are, and we're going to pick them right up in this inquiry case now. So we've had a couple weeks, or a couple of classes of talking about our new inquiry case, which is based on the idea of climate change and effects on Arctic ecosystems. There we go. We want to emphasize again that the structure of the course and the nature of the inquiry cases is such that we're adding more kinds of analysis and more levels of organization, more kinds of mechanisms, but we're not moving on from evolution and ecology when we add physiology, rather we're layering them on. So you'll see in this case we're going to talk a lot more about physiology, which is defined as topics related to structure and function, homeostasis, and levels of organization from the cell to the whole organism, essentially. But that will still be happening in the context of ecological properties and evolutionary mechanisms, so you'll hopefully start to see these things all tied together a bit more as we go. We talked a little bit about why we might be concerned with climate change, and that there are a number of different dimensions to that discussion, but that in this case we're going to be focusing primarily on biological questions. Sometimes those actually do inform other issues. So for example, biological questions about species distributions can play into things like effects on traditional hunting practices, or where humans can interact with nature in different ways, and so on. So that they're not all separate, but we are going to focus primarily on biological questions. You want to talk about this one?
Sure. So again, we're going to be referring always back to this type of chart that shows the biological levels of organization, but we're going to recognize that this time throughout the inquiry case we're going to be spending more time sort of near the bottom, talking about, hopefully we'll get all the way down to molecules and how a warming climate could affect molecular systems all the way up to individual systems. We need to post that paper.
It's up.
Oh, good, thank you. Please read it. It kind of gives you an overview, and hopefully it'll put you in a mindset for thinking about these types of things, so that you'll be able to experience what this long list of scientists also think, and how they make connections between different topics. And so we're seeing changes on all sorts of scales and at all sorts of levels. And here's just some examples that we've provided. They all have important consequences. And one of the things that we want you to kind of understand is that with some systems we may not see changes, or we may not see changes right away. And all of that can lead to very interesting discoveries and conversations about sort of fundamental biological adaptations. So not just about consequences and implications, but it can kind of elucidate or kind of make clear some really cool things that have evolved in nature to deal with a cold environment.
In terms of evolutionary questions in the context of climate change, there's a couple ways that it remains quite relevant. One of them is that this kind of change can impose selective pressures on populations over the shorter time scale that are relevant. So imposing constraints on microbial populations that causes evolutionary change in them, and so on. And there's also the context of the traits that we're talking about that are relevant to survival in the cold that have evolved as adaptations over time. And we can also talk about previous cases of climate change at different scales and different timelines in the past, so different glacial periods, and how organisms have dealt with those over sort of evolutionary time scales. So it remains relevant, even though we are focusing more on the organisms and their interaction with habitats. Evolutionary questions remain totally relevant here as well. So this paper is up too, and you can take a look at that one. It sort of gives another perspective on studying climate change from these perspectives, evolutionary and ecological perspectives.
So then we talked quite a bit about the polar bear. We covered things like, what would you like to know? What would be relevant information? We challenged you to think about things that would not be relevant necessarily in order to make predictions about what would happen. And then we took a look at some data. We presented you with the first glimpse of data related to the natural history or the biology of the polar bear. We showed you a distribution map. And we got you to think about what we can learn about a species by simply just looking at the distribution map. And we had a little bit of a discussion, and it was really good, really impressive. Lots of things that you were able to infer about the species just by looking at where it lives. So we talked about fundamental niche, and we talked about realized niche. Again, always touching back on those previous topics. Some of you brought up the possibility about some evolutionary origins and things like this, which was awesome. And we also touched on some physiological parameters. So it was a really good discussion that includes these things that we have posted in the slides. We then decided to give you some more data to start building up our conversation. And the thing that we presented in addition to the distribution of the polar bear was what's happening to the ice. And this is sea ice, so this isn't glacial ice. That's continental ice and has a different origin. But we were able to conclude, you guys did a really good job, that there are two bits of information here that are important. One is the overall trend, and that is that the ice is breaking up earlier and earlier in the year. And the other thing is that since the late 80s, early 90s, there seems to be more variation in that pattern of predictability. And that's important. That has huge consequences, especially for people. If they're less able to predict when things are happening, you can't make plans. And so it becomes a little bit disruptive, not just for the wildlife that's living there, but also for the people life. And so that was an important pattern that you noticed right away, which was great.
We also pointed out that you're talking about potentially significant changes, so it's not just that the ice is breaking up a day or two earlier. It can be several weeks, which if you're a polar bear, for example, and you do most of your feeding when there's ice, that can obviously have significant impact. So this is already potentially important to our polar bear question and all these other questions, even with just the change we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. So one of the other topics that we introduced was not just the notion of levels of organization or geographical scales of distribution, but time scales. And we wanted to introduce sort of three general time scales that have to be tailored to the specific groups in question, the organisms in question. But basically, they cover three types of time scales. Those are acute, chronic, and evolutionary or generational. So acute, we're essentially defining as an immediate stimulus and response kind of property at the organism level. This would be something like you're exposed to the cold for a short period of time, you start to shiver, those kinds of reactions. Again, the amount of time varies according to the sort of organism. Acclimatization is a longer exposure that has changes in some property in the organism in response to that, but they are much slower changes, and they would last longer after the exposure has been changed too. So something like if you're exposed to a lot of sun, you're in the tropics for a while, you'll produce more pigment, so there's actually protein production happening there, and that will also have a lag time. After you leave the sun, you'll remain tan for a while. You've become acclimatized to a different environment, and that is not an immediate change back. There's some fuzziness about these boundaries, of course, but those are the kinds of time scales we're talking about. Evolutionary adaptation, we mean either the origin of those things, those responses, those capacities for response at the first two levels, those are evolutionary products. But the second thing, and when we mean mostly when we talk about this, is if you changed an environmental parameter now, for example, and it was in its new state for many generations of exposure to an organism and its descendants, what would happen? What would the response be in evolutionary terms in that population? So yes, all of the adaptive responses at the acute and chronic levels are evolutionary in the sense that they evolved. Those responses, the ability to have those responses evolved. We're going to try to distinguish between acute, chronic, and evolutionary as if you were imposing the stimulus now and it lasted that amount of time. So the amount of time for an acute response versus the amount of time for evolution across generations, starting with the change now. And we'll just clarify, it's kind of important. The word adaptation gets used a little bit loosely. Physiologists might use it to mean the same thing we're saying in terms of acclimatization here, meaning that the organism adapts or changes in response to some stimulus from the environment. We're going to try to remember to always distinguish adaptation in the evolutionary sense from acclimatization in the physiological sense. If you want to get really technical, acclimatization is when it's to the natural environment. Acclimation is under experimental conditions. Adaptation is the evolutionary mechanism. So we talked a little bit about the fact that Arctic and Antarctic animals and plants have generally been in those ecosystems for many, many generations, and so they've evolved characteristics that allow them to cope with temperature changes on different timescales. So they can, for example, respond to, say, daily fluctuations in temperature, acute changes. They can respond to seasonal or chronic changes, and they've got adaptations that have to do with being in the cold for generation after generation. So if we're going to ask how climate change will affect different organisms, we need to think about how they've adapted to their current environments, or more accurately, their historical environments, and how they are built to respond to small, medium, and large-scale changes in temperature, both in terms of severity and in time scale. So this is a table, so you love tables.
It's easier for me to think in tables. So we have this table here to give you some examples and to give you some sort of comparisons across the different timescales. What we tried to do was kind of control for the same level of biological organization. So it's not like the examples that we give in the acute one are for bacteria, but the ones that we give in the chronic one are for mammals. We've tried to kind of keep it consistent, thinking about something that would be large-bodied. And the reason why I have to say all of those things is because it really does depend when we talk about the duration of those different timescales. Whether they would be different for bacteria. They would be different for bacteria compared to large mammals, for example. So we've tried to make it consistent across. And then just to give you an idea of some of the examples of the stimuli, and then some of the examples of, sort of comparable responses and different outcomes that might happen as a result of a sort of extreme stimulus or a kind of regular background type of a stimulus. And then we put Rick
Yes.
in a tub. Now, this was an example, I hope you can appreciate that this was an example of an acute stimulus relative to his biological level of organization. What we wanted you to do was to think a little bit about how you might tweak that stimulus to make it a chronic or a generational equivalent. And then what you might expect Rick's body to respond with given that change in the time scale. So acute was dipping him in a bath of very cold water for a couple of minutes. One of you pulled me aside while Dr. Gregory was talking and then gave a suggestion of how that might be turned into a chronic equivalent. And so one of you asked whether or not making Rick have a very cold bath every single day for years and years might be a very similar thing. And
Maybe.
It's possible, and there certainly is some research done on sort of regularized temperature exposures, but still it's for a short period of time, and so that's where, to me, it would kind of cloud the issue. So an easier, I hope, example of what a chronic exposure to the cold would be might be if Rick moved to Winnipeg. Or if he moved to the high Arctic, where it is just always colder, and lived his life within that particular environment. So that might be an effective way of modifying that time scale. So instead of cold exposure over a short period, Rick would be always exposed to cold temperature on a long period, right?
Yeah, and in terms of generational timescales, obviously that's not going to be a response that Rick himself has, right? By definition, we're talking about changes in the genetic makeup of a population over many generations. So that's not something Rick will experience, but rather the population of people. So in that case, you might imagine if there's a population of humans that lives in the Arctic for 5,000 years, generation after generation, do any particular adaptations evolve in that population? So it's not always an organism level response, but at least the first two are. I think to keep things simple, we'll try to say a chronic exposure is a sort of continuous exposure for a longer period of time, and acute is a short exposure, as opposed to chronic being repeated short exposures. That starts to get a little bit complicated.
So for Rick and the generational then, Rick would have to move to the Arctic and have lots of babies, and then his babies would have to have lots of babies, and it would have to go on for a few thousand years before we would expect there to be this evolutionary or sort of exposure that would result in evolutionary adaptations or responses.
And when you think about that, make sure you think about it in terms of variation in the population, which gets there by mutation, and then sorting of that variation by differential reproduction and survival. Not, if Rick goes up there and has a kid up there, that kid will be better at the Arctic survival, and then that kid's kid will be even better. Like, there's necessary progress. Remember how natural selection works, right? It has to be about variation in the population. So we talked a little bit about different kinds of organisms, and when we ask questions about what will happen under changing environments, you have to know a fair bit about the organisms in question. So for example, if we say, what happens if you change the temperature to which a vertebrate is exposed? Well, you might want to know, are we talking about a terrestrial organism or an aquatic one? Are we talking about an endotherm or an ectotherm? Are we talking about something that's covered in fur, or something that isn't adapted to thermoregulating in that way, and so on? So we played around with this a bit, but I would encourage you to think about this, or to go through different comparisons of different kinds of species to ask what's likely to happen if temperature goes up on a short time scale for the two kinds of organisms, or a more chronic time scale. So for example, if fluctuations in daily temperature become more severe, what will happen to aquatic versus terrestrial, or mammal versus fish? What if the overall average temperature throughout the year is just higher all the time? What will happen to those, and what kinds of things you would need to know? So there's a number of things we came up with, but you can also think of some other examples of that. Then we asked a question about why winter flounders don't freeze solid, given that they are in water that's potentially 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees below zero. And the reason the water doesn't freeze is it's salty, so the freezing point has been lowered. But we asked the question, nevertheless, why don't these fish, who normally have body fluids that would freeze at between maybe minus 0.5 to minus 1, why don't they freeze normally when they're in water that's minus 2? And we came up with an idea of applying our scientific approach to figuring out, first of all, what's the thing we're trying to explain, what's the pattern that we observe, developing some hypotheses, making predictions, designing experiments to test those predictions, and then interpreting our results. So this is just sort of your standard process of testing a particular idea. So we identified this pattern, which is a seasonal change in two features. One is the concentration of antifreeze protein in the blood of the fish, and the freezing point of their blood, essentially. And we noticed that there's not just a seasonal change, but that these things seem to change in opposite directions. So plasma antifreeze protein concentration goes up in the winter months, and freezing point of the blood goes down in winter months. So they can actually get colder before they freeze. And so the question is obviously there's some connection to this, but how is this seasonal pattern regulated? How does it get triggered to start producing this protein? So the first example that people came up with in terms of a hypothesis was that it's based on the temperature change in the water, which is a perfectly reasonable idea. So then we asked, how would you test this? We settled on doing it as an experiment in a lab, and in fact that's how a study on this question was approached, which is to have a control group of fish that are exposed to 10 degrees Celsius in this case, and an experimental group of fish that has a treatment of exposure to decreasing temperatures down to minus 1.5 degrees. And our prediction is that we should see higher antifreeze protein production as time goes on in the experimental fish and not in the control fish. So we asked you to think in your heads what a graph would look like if the experiment gives results that are consistent with that prediction. And the idea was that you should see a higher concentration of these antifreeze proteins in the experimentally treated fish versus the control fish. But in fact, you don't see that. There's no apparent relationship. So we concluded that it's probably not temperature, in fact, that's stimulating the production of these antifreeze proteins. So we needed an alternative hypothesis.
You very quickly came up with the idea that perhaps it's photoperiod. And so then we talked a little bit about how you might go about testing that. And in fact, the experimental design is pretty similar to the one that you use for temperature, except for now, instead of manipulating temperature, you're going to manipulate photoperiod. And that's indeed what the scientists did in order to figure out whether or not it was indeed photoperiod as the trigger. We got you to kind of try to visualize what the data might look like, and then we showed you the graph that the scientists were able to put together based on their data. And now we can see that photoperiod does seem to be associated with differences in the plasma antifreeze protein concentration. This, of course, yields all sorts of questions that come from it on different scales, both biological levels of organization, but also time scales. So some of the questions that come to my mind are, what are the consequences for an individual fish that's in a changing environment with respect to temperature, where they're not able to even detect that change necessarily? So temperature had no effect on their ability to increase or decrease the antifreeze proteins, which means that they're not able to detect a temperature change. What are the implications of that in light of the fact that the temperature is changing? And then maybe sort of a bigger question related to an evolutionary timescale is, why is it photoperiod that evolved as being the trigger? Why not temperature? It seems to me that it would be a smarter thing to do, maybe. So what are some of the reasons for the use of essentially a proxy variable in this case? So photoperiod is a proxy for temperature, but why did it evolve that way and why not the other way? Sometimes the answer is just because.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's an adaptive reason to some of those interesting questions that pop up.
So think about those.
And then we gave you some homework. So what we would like you to do is to read all of these statements, and for each statement, put an associated time scale, acute, chronic, or evolutionary, and an associated biological level of organization for each of them. And then for the clicker question, we'll actually give you ones, and then you'll pick out the one that doesn't match.